I'm John Shine from KIMT Television, Mason City, Iowa. We need your help. One of our news anchors is missing.
50 states, 50 disturbing stories, 7 levels. This iceberg is made up of the most disturbing things from every state. We're going to start with some of the more unusual stories, but the deeper we get, the more horrific things will become. Let's start at the tip of the iceberg. Level 1. Texas. In 1975, construction was underway in Texas on a news site for the Longview News Journal. But the construction crew stumbled upon something unexpected, a brick burial vault barely a foot below the surface. Inside, workers found a bolted cast iron coffin, its lid tightly screwed shut, and a small viewing window at face level. With a creak of rusted metal, the plate covering the glass was pried loose to reveal the face of a girl, preserved as if she'd only just slipped into sleep. Nobody knew who she was, where she came from, or really anything about her. But as more dirt was brushed away, it revealed a small, intact body sealed in there since the mid-1800s. Of course, as the oxygen seeped in, the more the preservation began to fade. So officials moved quickly to reseal the coffin under guard. But who exactly she was and what her story was, that would never, ever be known. North Dakota. Something had gone terribly wrong at Cody James Bellegarde's house on the Spirit Lake Reservation in North Dakota. It was January 14th, 2021, and 17-year-old Leroy Chapin, just 2 weeks past his birthday, was staying over. He was no longer breathing. Cody had pulled the trigger on his shotgun, ending his life instantly. But that wasn't enough for Bellegarde. Now the evidence had to disappear. So Cody set his own house ablaze after the killing, thinking the flames would consume the truth along with everything else while he fled to somewhere safer. The house fire was reported to authorities, but when they arrived, they found more than just burned remains. They found a body. Federal agents from multiple departments swarmed the scene, quickly identifying that this was not an accident. It was a cover-up. By March 2021, a federal grand jury indicted Cody for first-degree killing. But Cody's mental state complicated everything. Court-ordered psychological evaluations found him incompetent to stand trial, committing him for treatment. The jury, however, found him guilty of second-degree taking of life and arson. The judge sentenced Cody to 327 months, that's over 27 years, in federal prison. Had he not set fire to the house, he might have been able to get away with it a little longer. Thank goodness he didn't. Rhode Island. On the morning of December 21st, 2022, a fisherman was making his early rounds at Carbuncle Pond in Coventry, Rhode Island, when he spotted something unusual beneath the ice. Lila Duarte de Luz, 34 years old and 8 to 10 weeks pregnant, with lacerations covering her head. Her engagement ring was still on her finger. The medical examiner determined the body had been there for hours, trapped beneath the surface as her blood mixed with pond water. She had 6 separate blunt force injuries to her skull and water in her lungs, and she had been conscious when she entered the pond. The trail led back to Gary Gromkowitz and Michael Lambert, who drove to collect Lila from her home at 2 a.m. Cell phone data tracked their movements throughout Rhode Island, discovering that by 6:18 a.m., they were right next to Carbuncle Pond. It turns out that Gary was Lila's ex. She was carrying his unborn child. Their relationship was turbulent at best. He had met Michael Lambert in prison 20 years earlier, where Michael was serving time for the 1994 killing of a homeless man. Now it seemed they had repeated their crimes. The injuries to her head were inflicted before she was transported to the pond. Lambert's knuckles had fresh injuries during his arrest, but when police questioned Gary a week after the incident, he claimed to have no knowledge of her whereabouts. The case proceeded through a unique dual jury trial where separate juries heard evidence against each defendant simultaneously and ultimately reached guilty verdicts on charges of first-degree killing and conspiracy. In March 2025, both men were sentenced to life in prison plus 10 additional years. Utah. On July 5th, 2024, at around 1:30 p.m., a bolt of lightning hit somewhere in the rugged terrain of Utah. When firefighters arrived, they found barely 2 acres of flame in the steep, rocky landscape near the old Kimberly mining district. In fact, the fire smoldered for 10 days before anyone even noticed it was there. For 10 days, it slowly built heat in the dried brush. Then, that 2-acre flame suddenly exploded to 686 acres overnight. The fire was showing what officials would later call extreme fire behavior, with the flames jumping from treetop to treetop, creating their own weather patterns with winds that could shift 9 times in a single day. The dry air and strong winds made it easy for the fire to keep growing until, within 48 hours, the fire had consumed over 10,000 acres. Firefighters threw everything they had at it. Hotshot crews, bulldozers, very large air tankers dropping thousands of gallons of retardant. Nothing could stop it. The historic mining structures that had stood for over a century began to fall, forcing locals to evacuate their homes. 700 firefighters battled the flames around the clock. Fire consumed 18,222 acres before it was finally contained. Michigan. Michigan has an unusual natural habit. It trembles when it shouldn't. The state sits on the North American plate far from the fractures that typically cause earthquakes, but something does happen. In October 2010, residents near Menominee awakened to find that a massive crack had torn through the earth overnight, stretching 360 feet long and plunging 5 feet deep. Scientists called it a pop-up, where limestone bedrock suddenly fractures and thrusts upward, but they couldn't explain why it happened after lying dormant for 11,000 years since the glaciers retreated. Usually, pop-ups only occur near quarries where massive rock removal triggers instability, yet the Menominee crack appeared in pristine forest. More recent events blur the line even more. In 2018, a meteor exploded over southeastern Michigan with such force that it registered as a magnitude 2.0 earthquake. The scientists insist meteors cannot actually cause true seismic events, but the blast's shock waves traveled through the ground, mimicking earthquake signatures. Then came the discovery of approximately 40 perfectly circular craters scattered across Lake Michigan's floor, each stretching 300 to 600 feet wide and arranged in a weirdly linear pattern. Scientists found no evidence of groundwater movements that would explain sinkholes, leaving that one a complete mystery. Canton residents now report their homes shaking at night with such intensity that water ripples in glasses and pictures fall from walls. Vibrations occur repeatedly, sometimes lasting hours, but authorities cannot identify the source despite investigating utilities, airports, and nearby highways. Level 2. New York. On December 22, 2024, the F train sat idle on the platform at the Coney Island Stillwell Avenue station, carrying only 2 passengers in the early morning hours. One was a woman named Debrina Kawam. She was half asleep, wrapped in a blanket. The other passenger was Sebastian Zapata Khalil, an undocumented immigrant from Guatemala who had been living at a homeless shelter. His roommate would later tell reporters that Sebastian consumed about $30 worth of K2, a synthetic every day. The made him bug out and talk to himself, though he had never harmed anyone. Not yet. Sebastian told police he was so intoxicated that morning that he couldn't remember what happened next, but surveillance cameras did. He calmly walked up to Debrina and used a lighter to ignite her clothing, the flames engulfing her in seconds. Her blanket and clothes became fully engulfed in a matter of seconds. Then came the part that really disturbed people. Instead of fleeing, Sebastian got off the train and sat on a bench just outside the car, watching her burn. Officers patrolling the station above smelled smoke and rushed down to find Debrina standing inside the train car, completely engulfed in flames. By the time the flames were out, she was dead. Her body so severely burned that officials couldn't identify her for 9 days. When investigators finally showed Sebastian the surveillance video during questioning, his response was immediate. "Oh damn, that's me." yet he maintained his claim of having no memory of the incident. Hawaii. On June 23, 2024, on the north shore of Oahu, Tamayo Perry, a 49-year-old lifeguard, was on break from his duties. Just before 1 p.m. on that Sunday afternoon, Perry paddled out to surf near Goat Island off Malakaekehana Beach, a spot he had surfed thousands of times since childhood. The call came in at exactly 12:59 p.m. Someone on shore had spotted a body floating in the water. Perry had suffered multiple shark bites. The very colleagues who had worked alongside him for years now raced on jet skis to retrieve what remained of their friend. By the time lifeguards brought Perry's body to shore, there was nothing paramedics could do. He was pronounced dead. The news spread through the tight-knit North Shore community like wildfire, his death marking only the 9th fatal shark attack in Hawaiian waters since 1995. Within hours, shark warning signs appeared along the coastline. The Ocean Safety Department he had served declared his death a line-of-duty fatality, acknowledging that even on his break, Perry had been serving the community he loved. Colorado. Chuck Murphy knew something was wrong with the abandoned cabin in Woodland Park, Colorado for years. He always blamed the smell on dead mice and rotting wood. But on August 7, 2015, construction workers were demolishing the cabin to make way for new development when they pulled away the large breakfast bar and lodged deep in the chimney's brickwork, they found a mummified body curled into an impossible position. The corpse was folded in half, knees above the head, legs completely dislodged from the torso. The hands covered the face as if shielding from some final horror. But then investigators found clothes folded neatly by the fireplace. It was Joshua Vernon Maddox, an 18-year-old who had been missing for 7 years. His father had spent years searching, never knowing his son's remains were decomposing in a chimney just 2 blocks from home. The Teller County coroner ruled it an accident, theorizing that Maddox had tried to shimmy down the chimney Santa Claus style and gotten stuck. But Chuck Murphy wasn't buying it. A heavy steel mesh grate had been installed across the chimney opening, making entry from above impossible. Not to mention that to end up in such a contorted fetal position, Maddox would have had to enter the chimney head first. His clothes being folded inside the cabin suggested he had somehow gained entry to the building before ending up in the chimney. So how or why did he undress, exit a building, climb onto a roof, and attempt to enter through a chimney? To this day, the circumstances of how he ended up wedged in that chimney remain as puzzling as the day his body was discovered. Connecticut. On February 17, 2025, a 32-year-old man deliberately set fire to his locked bedroom in Waterbury, Connecticut using hand sanitizer, printer paper, and a lighter he'd hidden in his father's old jacket. For 20 years, this man had been trapped in what authorities would later describe as a room inside a room, an 8-by-9-foot space with locks on the outside. When Captain John Paul Oldham arrived that night, he initially thought he was looking at a mother and her young child. The emaciated figure wasn't a child, he was an adult man. As he was taken to safety, his stepmother, Kimberly Sullivan, stood outside holding her dog. The man's calculated escape plan had worked. He'd waited for Sullivan to go to her room at 8 p.m., then started the fire near his door, knowing she'd be forced to call for help when the flames grew too large to contain. The man told the police he'd been held captive since age 11, surviving on just 2 sandwiches and minimal water each day. The room itself was worse than a jail cell, according to Police Chief Fernando Spagnolo, who called it the worst treatment of humanity he'd witnessed in 33 years of law enforcement. Kimberly pleaded not guilty to charges including kidnapping, cruelty, and unlawful restraint, claiming her innocence. But the physical evidence tells a different story. Exterior locks, boarded windows, and a space so small it could barely contain a human being. She did this, no doubt. The man's desperate gamble with fire had finally given him what he'd told first responders he wanted all along: his freedom. California. There's an odd phenomenon on Bernard Avenue in Richmond, California. One resident was walking his dog one evening when he heard a firecracker-like sound. He looked up to see a dove perched on the power line suddenly fall to the ground. 5 minutes later, another pop rang out, and a starling hit the pavement in front of him. Initially, he thought, like anybody else, that it was electrocution. After all, more than 50 birds have dropped from power lines in recent months, each death preceded by one of these sharp pops. The deaths appear to be concentrated around a specific stretch of power line between two poles. But when the California Department of Fish and Wildlife conducted necropsies on 2 of the dead birds, they found no signs of electrocution. Actually, the birds showed injuries consistent with trauma that could have been caused by a pellet gun, BB gun, or slingshot. However, wildlife officials noted that the exact cause of the trauma to all of these birds could not be determined. Pacific Gas and Electric Company, which owns the power lines, maintains that their equipment is not responsible for the incidents. Company spokesperson Tamar Sarkeesian stated that the power pole meets avian safety guidelines established by the Avian Powerline Interaction Committee, which means that the only logical explanation left is someone actively shooting the birds off the wire. Yet so far, nobody has been able to prove that. New Jersey. Terrence J. Matthews had spent the previous night arguing with his ex-girlfriend, Cressida Williams, over the phone while she worked her shift, leaving him so enraged that he went straight to their shared home in Willingboro, New Jersey to do something horrific. While Cressida was at work, Terrence moved through the house he shared with her family, stabbing her mother and younger brother, forcing his head under the water in the bathtub until the child drowned. Cressida came home to find Terrence waiting, forcing her to look at what he had done and holding her hostage, leaving her knowing that she too would meet the same fate. By morning, she hatched a desperate plan. Terrence took Cressida to a Wawa convenience store on Springside Road. She approached an employee and whispered the words that would end her captivity. Terrence had killed her family. With police on the way, Terrence fled. Hours later, he was in the middle of a police chase, live streaming the whole thing and confessing what he had done. He showed no remorse for it. Then, the pole appeared. Even though he had crashed right into it, crumpling the car, he was alive and pulled from the wreckage. Terrence later pleaded guilty to the double homicide. The evidence was too strong to ignore. He received 60 years in prison. Level 3, Alabama. Betty Wilson answered the door of her Alabama home in May 1992, expecting police with updates about her husband's death. But instead, they had handcuffs. Months earlier, her husband, a respected doctor, came home after campaigning for a local politician to find a strange man in his home. James White beat the doctor repeatedly with the aluminum bat, fracturing his skull in multiple places and stabbing him in the chest to end his life. The scene looked like a botched burglary, but there were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked rooms, nothing stolen. An anonymous tip led police straight to James White, a handyman with a criminal record. Under interrogation, he claimed Peggy Lowe had seduced him with promises of love and money if he would eliminate her twin sister's husband. His story changed multiple times, but he insisted both sisters had orchestrated the plan, and phone records showed dozens of calls between White and Peggy in the weeks before the killing. The twins faced identical charges and separate trials, but while Betty was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, Peggy walked free after her acquittal, despite having the exact same evidence and circumstances. Years later, James White recanted his testimony, claiming Betty Wilson had nothing to do with her husband's death. But Betty remains behind bars, married to another inmate in 2006, while her twin sister lives her life freely. Delaware. Charles Holden walked out of the DuPont factory just after midnight on June 22, 1991, his 11-hour shift finally over. He stopped at Hardee's for a late-night meal, but in the parking lot, a stranger approached his truck window looking for a ride, claiming he needed to see his sister's newborn child. Charles agreed to give him a lift, at least part way. But when Charles said he'd gone far enough, the stranger held a screwdriver to his throat, demanding the truck. Charles played along, pretending to agree, then made his escape when the stranger began walking around to climb in. When Charles finally pulled into his driveway in rural Harrington, Delaware, he found the same man prowling around his mother's farmhouse. The 163-acre property sat in rural Harrington, Delaware, where Dorothy Donovan lived alone in the main house, with Charles in a trailer nearby. Charles called police instead of confronting the intruder, alternating between calls to the dispatcher and attempts to reach his 70-year-old mother. But the phone kept ringing unanswered. The broken window next to the back door told the whole story. Inside, Dorothy Donovan was dead in her bedroom, stabbed more than 24 times in the chest and face. A bloody palm print marked the banister leading upstairs. Police didn't believe Charles's story. How could a random hitchhiker find his way to this remote farmhouse? The stranger would have had to walk half a mile down a dark country road, make a turn, pass several other houses, and somehow know which one belonged to the man who'd abandoned him. Not to mention, reach the house before Charles without a clear mode of transport. Investigators soon discovered that Charles had financial problems and stood to inherit his mother's life insurance policy. When he refused a polygraph test, suspicions deepened. But there wasn't enough evidence. For 14 years, the case went cold. Then, in 2005, DNA technology confirmed that the bloody palm print on Dorothy's banister matched Gilbert Cannon, a 41-year-old career criminal who took that ride with Charles to get more rich. After being abandoned at the intersection, Cannon walked down the road searching for a place to sleep. He thought Dorothy's farmhouse looked empty, broke in through the back door, and found the elderly woman instead. When she woke up, he used Charles's screwdriver from their earlier fight to kill her, not knowing she was the mother of the man who'd given him a ride. All of this was pure randomness. Charles always told the truth. It was just too strange and unfortunate to believe. Tennessee. In December 2019, Sean Finnegan and his girlfriend Rebecca Dishman approached Jennifer Paxton, a woman living in a homeless camp near their Oak Ridge apartment, offering her a warm place to stay. The moment Jennifer stepped through their door, she became their prisoner. The couple immediately attacked her with a baseball bat, hitting her head and arms. They chained her to a bed, bound her hands with zip ties, and forced a dog collar around her neck. For days, they denied her food and medical care while repeatedly harming her. Sean took his time with the killing, using a string to strangle her slowly. But he didn't finish the job in one attempt. Instead, he would pause his strangling to take smoke breaks, leaving her conscious and aware. This pattern continued until Jennifer finally died. They broke up her body into parts, fitting her remains into a stand-up freezer and keeping them there for the next 8 months. When police finally came to search the home in August 2020, Sean pulled the decomposing body from the freezer and shoved it under his bed. The discovery led to his arrest and eventual conviction on multiple charges. In August 2024, a jury sentenced Sean to death by lethal injection. Rebecca gave him away in exchange for a life sentence. Montana. At 65, Leah Loken was a beast. She had proven herself as a national champion mountain biker, winning races even at age 59. She'd spent years navigating treacherous terrain, competing in intense races, demanding excellence. When she set out on the 2,700-mile Great Divide mountain bike route, she brought decades of cycling experience to what many consider the world's most demanding bikepacking adventure. On July 5th, 2021, Loken arrived in Ovando, Montana with her sister Kim and friend Katie Borner. She decided to camp behind the museum next to Kim and Joe Cole, fellow cyclists they'd met on the route. But at 3 a.m., a 417-pound grizzly bear wandered into their camp area close to Leah's tent. The 3 campers worked together, making noise to scare the animal away. It worked. The bear retreated, but this was just the beginning. The Coles, concerned for her safety, offered to help her find a hotel room where her sister was staying. But Leah declined. She returned to her tent, now armed with bear spray, and went back to sleep. Around 4:05 a.m., the Coles were awakened by sounds that indicated something was terribly wrong. They saw the dark shape of the bear pouncing up and down on Leah and her tent. Joe Cole immediately began yelling and deploying his bear spray, but it was too late. The bear had already pulled Loken from her tent and inflicted fatal injuries, and she was killed instantly. Wildlife officials finally shot and killed the animal on July 9th using night vision equipment as it approached a trap. DNA testing confirmed it was the same bear that had taken Leah's life. North Carolina. On July 6, 1993, in Windsor, North Carolina, the Bello grocery store was closing early so a cleaning crew could strip and wax the floors. Store manager Grover Cecil and employee Jose Reason were wrapping up, joined by 4 members of the cleaning crew. But a man had been waiting inside the store for who knows how long. When the doors were locked and the employees thought they were alone, he revealed himself carrying a .45 caliber handgun and gray duct tape. He ordered Cecil and Reason to empty the day's earnings into a plastic bag. But after collecting the money, the gunman didn't leave. He forced all 6 employees to the back of the store, binding their hands with the duct tape and stacking the victims into 3 piles of 2 people each. He was trying to save bullets. The gunman opened fire into the piles, killing 3 instantly, stabbing 1, and leaving 2 alive. When police arrived just after 7 p.m., they found a scene more gruesome than what most officers had ever witnessed. The killer walked out into the night and vanished. The Belo had security cameras, but they weren't working that night. The killer had claimed to be a recently fired police officer, but his fingerprints didn't match any law enforcement records. 32 years later, no arrests have been made, making this the most notorious crime in Bertie County history. Arizona. On Friday, October 17, 2003, Brandon Rumbaugh and Lisa Guerreri took Lisa's mother's white Ford F-150 for what was supposed to be a single night of camping to celebrate their 1-year anniversary under the stars. They had borrowed sleeping bags and a disposable camera in the perfect spot, a remote desert location 55 miles north of Phoenix, a ghost town. When Lisa's mother called to check on them during the drive, Lisa said they weren't there yet and still had so many miles to go. That was the last time anyone spoke to either of them alive. The next morning, when they didn't come home, the search began. At 3:30 p.m., the white F-150 was found parked in a secluded dirt area. Both Brandon and Lisa were still in their sleeping bags in the truck bed, both shot multiple times in the head. The medical examiner later determined they were killed with a .25 caliber handgun, an uncommon weapon for this type of incident. 100 feet away, they found the disposable camera broken in half and thrown aside. Despite the damage, technicians were able to recover several photographs. 2 of the recovered images showed Brandon and Lisa posing individually in the truck bed, believed to be the last photographs of them alive. But Lisa's mother, Paula, knew something was wrong in the photo. While Lisa appeared to be smiling, Paula could see fear in her eyes. She was looking slightly to the side and above the camera lens. Brandon's photo showed him in the same spot, arms crossed, with a straight expression. The 3rd recovered photograph showed a light fixture hanging inside an unidentified building. Neither family recognized the location. Investigators still haven't determined where this photo was taken or when it was captured. Ohio. In March 1976, Mary Gillespie found something disturbing in her mailbox. A letter with no return address postmarked from Columbus, Ohio. The message told her to stop the affair with Gordon Mazie, the school superintendent. The writer claimed to be watching her house, knew she had children, and this was no joke. Mary showed the letter to her husband Ron, but they decided to stay quiet, hoping it would stop. It didn't. More letters arrived, each more threatening than the last. The writer seemed to know intimate details about Mary's life that only someone close could know. Ron got the same warning. Eventually, the letters began to warn that if Mary didn't end her alleged affair, something would happen to her daughter. Ron was told to kill them both. On August 19th, 1997, Ron received a phone call. Whatever was said on that call sent him into a rage. He grabbed his gun, kissed his daughter goodbye, and told her he was going to confront the letter writer. His truck was found hours later wrapped around a tree. Ron was dead. A single bullet had been fired from his gun. But the letters didn't stop after Ron's death. They kept coming, hundreds of them over the following years, targeting residents around the community. By 1983, Mary was driving her school bus route when she spotted a crude sign about her 13-year-old daughter posted along the road. She stopped the bus and approached the sign, intending to tear it down. But then she saw it was attached to a wooden post which was connected to a small box by string. Instead of ripping down the sign, she carefully removed the entire contraption and loaded it onto her bus. When she opened the box later that evening, she found a .25 caliber handgun rigged to fire when the sign was pulled. The trap had been designed to kill her. Investigators traced the gun's serial number to Paul Freshore, Ron's brother-in-law. Paul claimed the gun had been stolen weeks earlier, but his estranged wife Karen believed he was the letter writer. Paul was arrested, convicted of attempted murder, and sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. But the letters kept coming, even while Paul sat in his cell. Prison officials confirmed he had no access to pens, paper, or stamps, yet dozens more letters appeared in Circleville mailboxes. Some were even sent to Paul himself, taunting him with messages like, "You can't catch me, I'm still out there, Paul isn't me." Paul served 10 years before being released in 1994. That same year, the letters finally stopped. The identity of the Circleville letter writer remains unknown. Mississippi. King's Tavern in Natchez, Mississippi, is the oldest building in the oldest city on the Mississippi River. Back in 1789, King Richard, a New Yorker who'd moved south with his family, purchased the old blockhouse, transforming it into a tavern and inn, a place where boatmen and stage riders could find shelter and drink. But the tavern's reputation grew darker with each passing year. The infamous Hart brothers, America's first documented serial killers, were locals. They had killed at the tavern. But the Hart brothers weren't the only source of the tavern's dark legacy. Richard King himself harbored secrets. He'd hired a 16-year-old girl named Madeline to work as a server. Despite being engaged to another man, Madeline eventually succumbed to King's persistent advances. Their affair continued in secret until Mrs. King discovered the truth. Decades later, in the 1930s, new owners began renovating the old tavern. Workers started dismantling the fireplace in the main dining room when they discovered skeletal remains that had been walled up behind the brick. 3 sets of bones, 2 men and 1 woman, along with a jeweled Spanish dagger. The woman's remains were said to belong to Madeline. The 2 men's identities remain unknown, but some believe they were the hired killers who ended her life. Others speculate Mrs. King dispatched them herself to cover her tracks. But for decades, the bodies remained hidden, literally built into the walls of the tavern. Today, visitors have noticed strange phenomena, like footprints appearing on freshly mopped floors, doors opening and closing on their own, and the sounds of a baby crying from empty rooms. The fireplace where the bodies were found still emits heat, even when no fire burns. Maine. On September 1st, 2006, Christian Charles Nielsen invited James Whitehurst, a fellow guest at the Black Bear Bed and Breakfast in Newry, Maine, on a fishing trip. They headed to the nearby town of Upton, stopping for a sandwich. As they began their trek through the wooded area toward the lake, Christian shot James in the back of the head 3 or 4 times. He abandoned the body, returning to work his evening shift as a line cook at the Sudbury Inn, as though it never happened. The following day, Christian returned to the woods and began digging a grave, only to change his mind. Using gasoline, he attempted to incinerate the evidence. Knowing that Julie Bullard, the 65-year-old innkeeper, would become suspicious about James' disappearance, Christian broke down her bedroom door while she slept and shot her 3 times in the chest. The next day, her daughter and her friend arrived unexpectedly, threatening Christian's spree once again. He shot and both women, and then their remains were left in heaps outside the inn. Christian manipulated his father into giving him an alibi, claiming that Julie Bullard had gone to California and left him in charge of running the inn. When Christian and his stepmother Lee Graham arrived at the property, they immediately noticed a trail of blood leading from the inn into the thick brush behind the building. After discovering the dismembered human remains, Christian called 911. When the police arrived, Christian had another change of heart, telling the officers he shot them all. Nielsen was arrested without resistance and charged. To this day, Nielsen has been unable to provide investigators with a coherent motive for his crimes. Level 4. Alaska. Valerie Kassler was homeless, desperate, and stealing from a man she'd met on the streets of Anchorage, Alaska, when she grabbed his phone from his truck's center console. He had offered her a place to stay, but back at her tent later that night, after days of substance use, Valerie powered on the device. The phone contained dozens of photos and videos of a woman being brutally harmed in what appeared to be a hotel room. She was fighting for her life while an accented voice narrated the scene like a movie director, telling her she would die and capturing the moment he killed her. Valerie transferred the contents to a memory card she had stolen from a department store and labeled it at Midtown Marriott, turning the evidence over to police, unleashing an investigation that would expose Brian Stephen Smith's brutality. Hotel records confirmed he had been registered at the Marriott during the exact time frame of the videos, and that he had driven around with her body for 2 days before dumping it. During interrogation, he admitted to a second killing, both Alaska Native women who had experienced homelessness. Smith was sentenced to 226 years in prison after a jury took less than 2 hours to convict him on all 14 charges. Valerie almost became the third victim. She managed to bring justice instead. Illinois. Benjamin Schneider needed potato seeds that March morning in 1874, so he walked to his neighbor's cabin in Saxtown, Illinois. When he arrived on the Stetsuritis' farmland, something was off. The livestock hadn't been fed and nobody was around to do the chores. But the bigger clue was that when he knocked on the door, nobody answered. Benjamin pushed inside and found Frederick Stetsurida's body sprawled across the floor, throat slashed, lying in a spreading pool of blood. 3 severed fingers lay nearby, and his skull was crushed beyond recognition. In the bedroom, Anna Stetsrida lay dead with her children, 3-year-old Carl and 8-month-old Anna. The baby's tiny arms were wrapped around her mother's neck, both bludgeoned to death. Old Carl Stetsrida, the grandfather, was found nearly decapitated, his head hanging only by threads of flesh. The weapon appeared to be an axe wielded by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Left behind, blood-stained tobacco leaves led investigators through the woods, but the trail went cold. The case remains unsolved as of 2025, with the original investigation files lost in the 1890s. Oklahoma. On October 8, 2009, Bobby and Sherilyn Jameson packed their truck in full view of a security camera. The 2 of them and their 6-year-old daughter, Madison, had driven from their Eufaula, Oklahoma home to scout a remote 40-acre plot near Red Oak. Then, the family vanished without explanation. 8 days later, hunters discovered their abandoned pickup truck on a mountain road in Latimer County. Inside the locked car, investigators found the family's ID, wallets, mobile phones, a GPS system, and $32,000 in cash stuffed beneath the driver's seat. The Jamesons were both on disability benefits, making the source of such a huge amount of cash inexplicable. Their dog, Maisie, was trapped in the back seat, barely alive after days without food or water. The surveillance footage from their home revealed some disturbing details. Both parents moved between their house and the truck in odd, trance-like behavior, making multiple silent trips without acknowledging each other. Sherilyn placed a brown briefcase in the vehicle during these preparations, which was never recovered. Police discovered an 11-page handwritten letter inside the truck, written by Sherilyn expressing her hatred for Bobby. Despite her desire for a divorce, no signs of struggle appeared anywhere near the vehicle. The truck showed no damage, contained fuel, and appeared to have been deliberately parked, but the family was nowhere to be seen. 4 years passed before hunters found skeletal remains of 2 adults and 1 child in November 2013, located around 2.7 miles from where the truck had been abandoned. The Oklahoma medical examiner positively identified the remains as the Jamison family. However, the bodies were so decomposed the officials could not determine a cause of death. All they have left is that inexplicable footage. New Mexico. Just after midnight on January 19, 2013, in New Mexico, 15-year-old Nehemiah Grigo crept into his parents' bedroom with a .22 caliber rifle. His mother, Sarah, slept next to his 9-year-old brother, Zephaniah, unaware that Nehemiah had been planning this moment for over a week. He fired 1 shot into her head, waking his brother. The second shot followed immediately. Nehemiah's other younger siblings had woken up to the 2 shots and instantly knew something had happened. As they cried, Nehemiah walked into their bedroom, rifle in hand, and fired once into each of their heads. The house fell silent again. Nehemiah retrieved his father's AR-15 from the closet and positioned himself in the downstairs bathroom, waiting. Greg Grigo was finishing his overnight shift at the Albuquerque Rescue Mission, helping homeless families find shelter. When he walked through the door at 5 a.m., his son ambushed him with multiple shots. With his entire family dead, Nehemiah reloaded both weapons, loaded them into the family van, and drove to meet his 12-year-old girlfriend. Before seeing her, he had sent her a photograph of his dead mother. They spent the day together attending church activities. For these 18 hours, Nehemiah wandered the church grounds, chatting with congregation members who had no idea about the 5 bodies at home. When church security chief Vince Harrison finally drove him home that evening, Nehemiah calmly detailed where each family member's body could be found. He knew the game was over. Pennsylvania. By November 1974, Joseph Callinger, a Philadelphia shoemaker, had claimed his first victim, a 10-year-old boy named Jose Collazo. He wasn't alone. His 12-year-old son, Michael, stood beside him, not a witness, a partner. This father and son masterminded a series of home invasions, posing as salesmen to gain entry to unsuspecting homes. Once inside, they tied up the residents and then took what they wanted. As they grew more and more confident, they started expanding across state lines, but they stuck to their choreography: forced entry, restraint, humiliation, and theft. The spree reached its climax on January 8, 1974, in the quiet town of Leonia, New Jersey. They gained entry to the Romaine family home using their script. For 2 hours, they abducted each person who entered the house, 7 people. When 21-year-old nurse Maria Fashing arrived to check on an elderly resident, she became their 8th and final victim, but she refused to comply, forcing them to kill her. After that, witnesses saw the father and son pair attempting to wash blood from their garment in a puddle near the crime scene. When the cleaning failed, they discarded it and fled. That shirt contained a manufacturer's label, store tag, and cleaner's mark that led police directly to Joseph Callinger's shoe repair shop in Philadelphia. Michael was arrested alongside his father, ending a 6-week campaign of terror that had left 3 people dead and 4 families shattered. Virginia. In September 2003, Virginia suffered one of its worst natural disasters when Hurricane Isabel carved its path of destruction across the state, revealing the terrifying power of nature when it meets human settlements. The storm arrived as a Category 2 hurricane, but delivered devastation that would reshape the region for years to come. Virginia bore the brunt of Isabel's fury, experiencing what would become the costliest natural disaster in the state's history. The storm affected 99 counties and cities, an unprecedented scope of destruction that left 1.8 million people without power. 36 people in the state died from Isabel's effects, 10 directly from the storm and 26 from indirect causes. The dead included a driver who crashed into a flooded creek in Henrico County and a motorist on Interstate 95 in Richmond who hydroplaned and died when his car crashed. Isabel's storm surge reached 9 feet in Richmond along the James River, while unofficial estimates put water levels at nearly 11 feet in some coastal areas. The state had never experienced flooding this bad. The storm permanently changed the landscape, leaving communities that had never experienced such devastation confronting the reality of climate change. South Dakota. In the quiet town of Centerville, South Dakota, on Memorial Day 2024, a conversation between husband and wife escalated into something that would shatter 3 families forever. Jay Ostrom was a former officer turned former mayor. 4 days earlier, on May 23rd, Jay's wife had been drinking with their neighbor, Paul Frankus, while Jay slept in another room. According to court documents, Paul forcibly kissed her, exposed himself, and rubbed his genitals against her. She kept this violation to herself for 4 days, the weight of it building until she couldn't hold it any longer. When she finally told her husband, he stormed out of the house. Wielding a shotgun, he took out Paul's brother, then took out Paul himself. When officers arrived, they found Jay walking away from the scene, bleeding from his left hand and reeking of alcohol. He initially ignored commands to stop, but eventually complied, lying down on the ground. He had been carrying an AR-style rifle, a .380 handgun, and the spent casings from both guns. Jay was charged with 9 felony counts. He pleaded not guilty and not guilty by reason of insanity, setting up a defense that would question his mental state during those fatal minutes. Wyoming. Deep in Wyoming's Medicine Bow National Forest on September 17, 2020, something was stirring. A fire was building, but nobody could have predicted how quickly it would become a monster. Within just 2 days, the fire had consumed 7,000 acres. The early growth seemed manageable, but the conditions were perfect for destruction. Years of mountain pine beetle infestations had left the forest littered with dead trees, creating vast fields of tinder-dry fuel. The drought conditions across southeastern Wyoming meant everything was ready to burn. 12 days after ignition, the fire had exploded to 82,649 acres, consuming everything in its path as the wind pushed flames across the landscape. The gusts were carrying embers miles ahead of the main fire, creating spot fires that jumped highways, crossed rivers, and overwhelmed the defensive lines firefighters desperately tried to establish. By the time significant snow fell in late October, the Mullen Fire had consumed 176,878 acres. It had burned through 40% of the southern Medicine Bow Range Mountains. Nobody stood a chance at stopping that. Level 5. District of Columbia. On January 29, 2025, at 8:47 p.m., American Airlines Flight 5342 had just completed a routine flight from Wichita, Kansas, carrying 60 passengers and 4 crew members. But as it was descending toward Ronald Reagan National Airport, it intersected with the U.S. Army's Sikorsky UH-60L Black Hawk helicopter carrying 3 soldiers. The helicopter was on what officials described as a training mission. But the helicopter designation, PAT-25, raised some questions. Priority air transport usually signifies VIP missions, not routine training flights, which is odd. But regardless, this was a very preventable disaster. Air traffic control had specifically asked the helicopter pilot, "PAT-25, do you have the CRJ in sight? PAT-25, pass behind the CRJ." The helicopter pilot had earlier confirmed visual contact with the civilian aircraft and requested visual separation, meaning he would navigate around the plane using his own eyes. There was no response to that final instruction. Video captured from the Kennedy Center showed the moment of collision, causing a brilliant fireball erupting in the night sky before both aircraft plummeted into the Potomac River. The crash marked the deadliest U.S. air disaster since American Airlines Flight 587 crashed in Queens, New York in November 2001, killing 256 people. It was also the first major U.S. commercial passenger flight crash in nearly 16 years, ending an unprecedented era of aviation safety. All 67 people aboard both aircraft died just 3 miles from the White House and U.S. Capitol. Maryland. Jared W. Ramos stormed into the Capitol Gazette building on June 28, 2018, armed with a shotgun and a lot of resentment. Back in 2011, Jared reached out to a high school classmate on Facebook, claiming she was the only person who had ever been kind to him. When she suggested he seek counseling, he began a year of harassment, urging her to end her life and stalking her until she pressed charges. 5 days after Jared pleaded guilty to criminal harassment, the Capitol Gazette published Eric Hartley's column titled, "Jared Wants to Be Your Friend," detailing the whole case. Jared sued for defamation in 2012, claiming the paper had painted him as some sort of internet predator and ruined his life. The courts dismissed his case twice. After a year of threatening the paper and its workers online, Jared drove to the Capitol Gazette offices carrying a shotgun, smoke grenades, and a backpack loaded with tactical equipment. At 2:33 p.m., he barricaded the rear exit, trapping his victims inside and detonating smoke bombs to create chaos and confusion, then blasting through the glass front door with his shotgun. The gunman moved through the newsroom, seeking out his targets and shooting them. 5 employees never made it out. 4 died at their desks, 1 at the hospital. When police arrived within 60 seconds, they found Ramos hiding under a desk, his weapon nearby, calmly waiting to surrender. The entire attack lasted just minutes, but he got what he wanted: revenge. Of course, he really just proved their point. Missouri. In 1901, Frederick, a member of Missouri's Lemp Brewing dynasty, collapsed from heart failure, leaving behind his empire. His father, William Sr., never recovered from the shock, spending 3 years in a haze of depression before walking into his second-floor bedroom on February 13, 1904, and ending his life. That pattern would repeat for the next 45 years. Billy Lemp Jr. took over the family business but lacked his father's instincts. The brewery floundered under his leadership, and his personal life crumbled alongside it. When Prohibition arrived in 1919, Billy shuttered the company without notice, selling the brewery complex. 2 years before Billy's death, his sister Elsa added her name to the family's legacy. After 2 divorces with the same man, she shot herself in the heart while lying in bed at their house. When Billy arrived at the scene, he reportedly said, "That's the Lemp family for you." Billy followed his sister into death on December 29, 1922. The bullet found his heart just as it had found his sister's. No note was left behind or reason given. Charles Lemp, the third son, moved into the mansion in 1929 and lived there as a recluse for 20 years. He never married, sharing the vast house with only 2 servants and his dog. On May 10, 1949, Charles first shot his dog in the basement, then climbed the stairs to his bedroom. The animal, bleeding and dying, dragged itself up the stairs to be near its master in its final moments. Charles placed the gun to his right temple, the same spot where his father had placed his weapon 45 years earlier, and ended it all. The mansion became a tomb for the family. 4 men ended their lives within those walls, each choosing the same permanent solution to their temporary problems. Idaho. On November 13, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were stabbed to death in their off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. They were all attacked with a fixed-blade knife while they slept, the intruder moving through the 3-story house methodically, targeting the 2nd and 3rd floors. 2 roommates were also in the house that night, but survived by remaining on the 1st floor. Around 4 a.m., Mortensen heard strange noises and crying coming from upstairs. She opened her bedroom door and saw a man dressed in black with a ski mask on walking past her. She locked herself in her room with the other survivors. The surviving roommates stayed locked in the room for hours, too terrified to emerge. They didn't call 911 until nearly 8 hours later at 11:56 a.m. when friends came over to check on the house. When they finally went upstairs, they discovered the bodies. The case remained unsolved for 7 weeks until investigators traced DNA evidence back to Brian Kohberger, a 28-year-old criminology graduate student at nearby Washington State University. Kohberger was arrested on December 30th, 2022 at his parents' home in Pennsylvania. In July 2025, he pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree killing and 1 count of burglary, accepting a plea deal that spared him the death penalty but sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Vermont. At 3:45 a.m. on September 15, 2024, Brian Crossman Jr. made a 911 call that would begin the unraveling of his elaborate lie. He told Vermont State Police he'd discovered the bodies of his father, stepmother, and 13-year-old stepbrother scattered throughout their home, blood everywhere, shotguns on the floor. He claimed he'd gone for a midnight walk and returned to find his family dead. But the details began to fracture under scrutiny. Police discovered that Brian's phone contained multiple searches about serial killers and unsolved cases. His father's work vehicle showed GPS data indicating he'd returned from a late-night power company call at 12:47 a.m., just minutes before Brian claimed to have left for his midnight walk. When police arrived at the home, they found Brian Crossman Sr. lying in front of the mudroom entrance, shot in the head and torso. His wife Erica was found nude in her bedroom, her body positioned unnaturally with a gunshot wound to her head. The house had shotguns scattered throughout, an open gun safe, and casings from both 12-gauge and 20-gauge shotguns. The facade continued to crumble when investigators found inconsistencies in his timeline and discovered additional bloody clothing in the same room where Erica's body was found, clothes he'd allegedly changed out of. He was admitted to a mental health facility that same day, but by September 19th, he was arrested on 3 counts of aggravated homicide. He seemed largely unfazed by the whole thing. West Virginia. Between July 2017 and June 2018, nursing assistant Rita Mays worked the overnight hours when Ward 3A grew quiet. Veterans in their 80s and 90s were in recovery beds, medical histories spanning wars from Korea to Vietnam, most of them stable and waiting to leave. But Rita had no license, no certification, no medical training beyond her basic duties. She did, however, carry syringes filled with insulin she had no authority to touch. Soon enough, the patients started dying rapidly, their blood sugar readings plummeting to levels that made no medical sense. Their bodies were shutting down en masse. At first, hospital staff initially attributed the deaths to natural causes. After all, these were elderly patients with complex medical histories. Yet all of the patients experienced hypoglycemic episodes that sent them into comas. None of them had diabetes. As the deaths mounted, Mays began conducting internet searches on female serial killers. Soon, the pattern became unmistakable for those around her. Every death occurred during her shift, every victim under her care. The hospital fired her in June 2018. By then, at least 20 suspicious deaths had occurred during her tenure. She would later tell investigators she administered the insulin to patients she believed were suffering so they could die gently. She received 7 consecutive life sentences plus 20 years. Iowa. Amy Coons, producer at KIMT TV in Mason City, Iowa, had a problem. Her morning anchor was missing. Jody Huizen-Truitt said she had overslept and would be there soon, but Jody never showed up. When police arrived at her apartment complex at 7:16 a.m., they found her red Mazda Miata still parked in the lot, but scattered around the car were her red high heels, a blow dryer, hairspray, car keys, and earrings. The key to her Miata was bent. There were drag marks near the vehicle, as if someone had been waiting for her. Neighbors reported hearing a scream around 4:30 a.m., though no one had called police. One witness saw a white van with its headlights on. It seemed as though someone had grabbed Jody as she walked to her car. In fact, just 8 months before her disappearance, Jody had called police about a man in a white pickup truck who had been following her. The day before she vanished, she had told fellow golfers at a charity tournament that she was planning to change her phone number because she'd been getting nasty calls. The search for Jody consumed Mason City. She had simply vanished. By 2001, she was declared legally dead. Nearly 3 decades later, the case remains open. Kansas. Andrew Schreiber had stopped at a convenience store on December 8, 2000, when 2 men forced him into his own vehicle. They drove him to 3 different ATMs, draining his account of $800. By the time they left him stranded on a dirt road with shot-out tires, the brothers had already decided this was just the beginning. 3 days later, the violence escalated. They shot and killed Ann Walenta, a 55-year-old cellist with the Wichita Symphony. They chose their following target randomly: a triplex at 12727 East Birchwood Drive. Inside, 5 friends were gathered: Jason Befort, his girlfriend H.G., Brad Haka, Aaron Sander, and Heather Mueller. What happened next would earn the incident the name Wichita Massacre. The brothers burst through the door armed with handguns and a golf club. They forced all 5 into Jason's bedroom, ordering them to strip naked. For hours, they subjected their captives to unimaginable brutality. They forced the women to perform intimate acts on each other while the men were made to watch. When they were satisfied, they loaded all 5 victims into vehicles and drove them to ATMs throughout the city, emptying their bank accounts. Nearly $2,000 was withdrawn from the accounts. The final destination was a snow-covered soccer field at an abandoned sports complex. The temperature was below freezing, and the naked victims were forced to kneel side by side in the snow. One by one, the brothers shot each person in the back of the head. Then they drove Jason's truck over the bodies, ensuring their work was complete. But one of them survived. The bullet had struck her hair beret, deflecting the fatal shot. After the brothers left, she walked naked through the snow for nearly a mile, following the glow of Christmas lights until she found help. Before seeking medical attention, she gave police detailed descriptions of them: Reginald and Jonathan Carr, the brothers. The brothers returned to the Birchwood house the next day looking for more valuables. They found her small schnauzer and beat the dog to death with a golf club. But the police arrested them at the scene. The brothers had committed 113 separate criminal acts in just over a week. 5 people were dead, and 2 others would carry the physical and psychological scars forever. In October 2002, both brothers were sentenced to death. Arkansas. By the time Grant Hardin arrived in Gateway, Arkansas in 2016, he had already been dismissed from the Fayetteville Police Department for failing to meet training standards. Yet Gateway still appointed him police chief, a position he held for just 4 months before his world began to collapse. On February 23, 2017, James Appleton sat in his truck talking to his brother-in-law on the phone. Appleton mentioned seeing a white vehicle speed past him and stop, saying, "I think it's a policeman or something." The next sound Tillman heard was like a door slamming, then silence. Appleton had been killed with a single shot to the head. The investigation quickly pointed to Hardin, but when authorities collected his DNA, they entered it into the DNA database and discovered he was the key to an unsolved crime that had haunted Rogers, Arkansas for nearly 2 decades. On November 9, 1997, Amy Harrison, a 27-year-old teacher at Frank Tillery Elementary School, was confronted by an armed attacker. For over 20 years, the case remained unsolved despite Harrison's detailed description and a police sketch. DNA evidence had been preserved, but there was no match in the system. In 2003, as the statute of limitations approached, authorities issued one of Arkansas's first John Doe DNA warrants, essentially indicting the unknown genetic profile to keep the case active. Hardin's DNA matched. At the time of Harrison's attack, Hardin had been working as a police officer in nearby Eureka Springs. Hardin received 2 consecutive 25-year sentences, bringing his total prison time to 80 years. Level 6, Wisconsin. Natalie Lynn Rupnow arrived at Madison, Wisconsin's Abundant Life Christian School on December 16, 2024, just like any other Monday morning. 3 hours into the school day, she pulled out a 9mm Glock handgun and opened fire, killing substitute teacher Erin Michelle West and 14-year-old student Ruby Vergara. Before police could reach her, Natalie turned the gun on herself, taking herself out in the same room where she just ended 2 lives. At 10:57 a.m., a second-grade teacher dialed 911. Fortunately, officers were already training just 3 miles away and reached the school within minutes. By 11:05 a.m., they found Natalie already down, the weapon recovered. Emergency responders loaded her into an ambulance, but she was declared dead while being transported to the hospital. Parents were relieved that their children had survived the lockdown, but 2 students remained in critical condition, fighting for their lives. A small school of 390 students, which had served as a refuge for children escaping bullying elsewhere, now faced its own devastating trauma. Investigators would later discover Natalie had been planning this attack, even building a cardboard model of the school to prepare fully. She wrote a manifesto. It turns out her father had given her the weapons, hoping to bond with her through firearms, unknowingly providing the very ammunition she'd use to carry out her final, devastating plan. Indiana. Herb Baumeister owned a successful chain of thrift stores in Indianapolis. He had a wife and 3 children, living in a $1 million estate called Fox Hollow Farm in Westfield, Indiana. To neighbors and customers, he appeared to be just another prosperous businessman. The reality was far more sinister. When his wife Julie and their children would leave for months at a time during summer vacations, Baumeister would frequent gay bars in downtown Indianapolis, targeting young men in their 20s and 30s. Using the false name Brian Smart, he would approach these men, charm them, and convince them to come back to his sprawling 18-acre property. Throughout the 1990s, gay men would vanish after nights out at local bars, and their absences often went unreported or were not prioritized by police. Baumeister was taking advantage of society's prejudices. The killings continued for years, with Baumeister potentially responsible for the deaths of at least 25 men, though some estimates suggest the number could be even higher. His son discovered the first evidence of these crimes in 1994 when he found a human skull while playing in the woods. But the investigation only began in earnest in 1996, when a survivor of Baumeister's attempted strangulation spotted him again and followed his car, noting down the license plate number. Police soon identified Brian Smart as Herb Baumeister, but when they asked to search his property, both he and his wife refused. By June 1996, Julie had filed for divorce and allowed police to search the property while Baumeister was away on vacation. They found over 10,000 bone fragments and pieces of human remains scattered across the property. The bones were burnt and crushed, making identification extremely difficult. Rather than face arrest, Baumeister fled to Canada. On July 3, 1996, he was found dead, having shot himself with a .357 Magnum. Minnesota. Late on June 14, 2025, 57-year-old Vance Luther Bolter, dressed in tactical gear and wearing a realistic silicone mask, pulled up to a suburban Minnesota home in an SUV fitted with flashing emergency lights and police plates. He knocked on the door of Democratic State Senator John Hoffman, shone a flashlight in the couple's faces, and opened fire, critically wounding both Hoffmans with multiple rounds. From there, Vance drove to former House Speaker Melissa Hortman's residence, repeated the ruse, and fatally shot Hortman and her husband at close range. Investigators later found assault-style rifles, a handgun, ballistic vest, mask, a gold badge, and notebooks listing 45 Democratic officials in his car. His book included notes on home layouts and surveillance observations. He had researched targets for months, scouting entry points and mapping escape routes. A 2-day manhunt involving dozens of law enforcement agencies ended with Vance's arrest near his rural farm, where he surrendered without resistance. He now faces federal and state charges for second-degree killing and attempted killing, stalking, and weapons offenses, as authorities work to piece together the full scope of his planned attack. Washington. In early 1910, snow hammered Wellington for nearly a week, piling drifts up to 17 feet high. 2 Great Northern trains, Spokane Local No. 25 and Fast Mail No. 27, ended up stalled beneath the windy mountain's jagged face, trapped against the west portal of the original Cascade Tunnel under an unrelenting blizzard. On February 26, the telegraph lines suddenly snapped. By March 1st, rain and thunder shattered the frozen calm. Just after 1 a.m., lightning fractured the snowpack, and in an instant, a colossal slab ripped free, sending a half-mile-long, quarter-mile-wide wave of snow careening down the slope with brutal force. The avalanche instantly hit the depot, hurling locomotive and cars 150 feet into the Tye River Valley. Passengers and crew, many of them asleep and unaware, were swallowed by the snow without warning. Witnesses described the roaring avalanche as being like 10,000 freight trains exploding as it engulfed everything in its path. Rescue efforts were frantic. Survivors were dug out by townsfolk and railway workers, but 96 lives were lost. Washington would never fully recover from the devastation. Kentucky. Since 1999, Robert Franklin Smallwood Jr. had been quietly ending lives in Lexington, Kentucky, in 3 separate sprees over the course of 7 years. His first victim, Doris Ann Roberts, lived alone, found only days later by worried neighbors who forced their way inside, discovering her lifeless body after she had been gagged and strangled with her own clothing. 3 years passed before Robert struck again. Sonora Allen had met family on 4th Street in August 2002 before vanishing. Days later, her body turned up dumped in a Fortune Pizza parking lot. No obvious wounds marked her corpse, but the medical examiner determined she'd been strangled or smothered to death. Sonora's shorts were pulled down to her thighs, her tank top lifted over her breasts, suggesting she had been assaulted too. Then, the killing spree went quiet until April 2006, when Robert invaded 33-year-old Erica Butler's home and ended her life. In August 2006, Kentucky State Police forensic analyst made the connection everyone had missed. DNA evidence from all 3 crime scenes matched, revealing that a single perpetrator had been methodically targeting women across Lexington. But Robert was already behind bars, serving time for violating his probation on an unrelated matter. However, the DNA trail stretched back even further. A 1993 case involving an 83-year-old retired school teacher who had been attacked in her home, bound and violated by an intruder who left behind genetic evidence, had never been tested. When that cold case kit was finally processed years later, it connected directly to the 3 recent killings. It was Robert. He'd been hiding in plain sight. Robert initially pleaded not guilty, but eventually changed his plea and received life imprisonment without parole on November 2007. Oregon. Chris Harper Mercer entered an English classroom at UCC near Roseburg, Oregon, carrying 6 handguns, a semi-automatic rifle, body armor, and extra magazines, all obtained through lawful background checks. He ordered students to stand and identify their faith, then opened fire on them, killing 7 on the scene and leaving 2 more to succumb to wounds at a nearby hospital, bringing the toll to 9. Fortunately, officers arrived quickly, exchanging in gunfire with Chris in a brief hallway skirmish. After being wounded, he took his own life before he could be taken into custody. Investigators later found 7 additional firearms at his apartment, none of them reported stolen, all legally purchased by him or family members over the previous 3 years. The unsettling fact that every weapon passed background checks has fueled some debate over the limits of lawful purchase and whether it even prevents attacks like this one. Could it be avoided with this system? Apparently not. Massachusetts. Between March 1988 and April 1989, at least 9 women and 2 more never recovered were found strangled and abandoned along the lonely off-ramps of Interstate 195 and Route 140 near New Bedford, Massachusetts. Each body had the same characteristics: a knot wrapped around the throat with an item of clothing. These women shared fragile lives, all battling addiction or eking out a living offering intimate services. All of them disappeared from their daily lives only to be later discovered dead, if they were ever found at all. The New Bedford killer was never discovered or identified, meaning he may well still be out there somewhere. But for these women, their lives were cruelly stripped away from them, their bodies callously abandoned on the side of the road. Level 7. New Hampshire. On an afternoon in October 1978, Catherine Milliken left work to photograph birds at the Chandler Brook Wetland Preserve in New London, New Hampshire. She never made it home. Her body was found the next day just yards from where she'd parked her car, bearing 29 stab wounds. The Connecticut River Valley killer was just getting started. 3 years later, another woman disappeared while hitchhiking near the Massachusetts-Vermont border. Her body turned up weeks later in Unity, New Hampshire, 80 miles from where she'd last been seen. In the mid-1980s, 3 more women vanished from Claremont, New Hampshire, their skeletal remains discovered within 1,000 feet of each other in the woods of Kellyville. Between those discoveries, another woman was brutally stabbed to death in her own home in Saxtons River, Vermont. 10 days later, another body was found, also showing multiple stab wounds. The killer just kept finding more and more victims and managing to evade capture. But his luck was running out. Jane Borowski was 22 and 7 months pregnant, stopping for a soda at a closed convenience store in Swansea, New Hampshire, when a man in a Jeep Wagoneer pulled up and tried to drag her out of her car. She fought back, but he tackled her to the ground and stabbed her 27 times, leaving her for dead. But Jane survived. Both she and her unborn daughter lived, managing to drive to a friend's house and call for help. For the first time in a decade, the killer had left a living witness. The killing spree stopped after that night. The Connecticut River Valley killer simply vanished. No one knows if he died, moved away, or was spooked by leaving a survivor. Jane Borowski remains the only person who looked into his face and lived to tell about it. South Carolina. 21-year-old Dylan Roof had been planning this for months. His roommate knew it. He'd been talking about starting a civil war and complaining that, in his words, blacks were taking over the world. The gun his parents bought him for his birthday had been sitting in his room for weeks, waiting. They'd never let him take it before. On the evening of June 17, 2015, Dylan drove to Charleston with 88 hollow point bullets loaded into 8 magazines. He sat in his car in the parking lot of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the oldest black church in the South. For 2 centuries, it had been a symbol of black resistance. It was about to be the site of a massacre. Dylan entered through an unlocked side door and joined the Wednesday night Bible study alongside 20 other people in the basement room. He stayed for 45 minutes listening to the scripture lesson. When they closed their eyes for the final prayer, Dylan took out his .45 caliber Glock and began shooting. Dylan moved through the room, reloading multiple times, firing approximately 74 rounds. When he reached one parishioner who was praying aloud, he told her to shut up and asked if he had shot her yet. He told her, "I'm going to leave you here to tell the story." 9 people died in total. Dylan walked out calmly, looking both ways before he drove away in his black sedan and was captured 14 hours later at a traffic stop in North Carolina. He confessed to investigators that he wanted to start a race war and almost didn't go through with it because everyone was so nice to him. But he decided he had to go through with his mission, causing chaos to many innocent Christians. Louisiana. In 1997, the bodies of men began surfacing in the sugarcane fields and bayous of southeastern Louisiana. The victims shared disturbing patterns. They were vulnerable men, all homeless, often engaged in exchanging intimacy for money. Each had been strangled, their bodies dumped in remote locations across 7 parishes. They were all victims of Ronald Joseph Dominique. Ronald would cruise dark streets in his pickup truck, hunting men walking alone or riding bicycles. He'd slow down, roll down his window, and offer money for companionship. Other times, he'd pull out a photograph of a woman, supposedly his wife, and spin an elaborate story about how she'd been traumatized but still craved intimacy from strangers, provided the man would agree to be restrained. The restraints were key. Ronald never killed anyone who refused to be tied up. If a potential victim declined, he'd simply drive them back to where he found them, releasing them unharmed. But for those who agreed, the ropes sealed their fate. Once bound, they were completely at his mercy. By 1999, Ronald had claimed 9 victims, all strangled with extension cords, seatbelts, or by hand. The victims ranged from 16 to 46 years old, most African American, most living on society's margins. But then, a man named Ricky Wallace came forward with a story that would crack the case wide open. Ricky had accepted a ride from Roland, but refused to be tied up, saving his life. But when Ricky's friend Chris DeVille became victim number 22, Ricky connected the dots and reported the story to police. In October 2006, DNA evidence came back as a match. On December 1st, 2006, investigators arrested Roland at a homeless shelter in Houma and got him to confess to 23 killings. In 2008, he pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree killing to avoid the death penalty. He received 8 consecutive life sentences without parole. He remains incarcerated at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. Nebraska. On December 5th, 2007, at the West Road Mall in Omaha, Nebraska, holiday shoppers were searching for perfect gifts just 3 weeks before Christmas. What they didn't know was that 19-year-old Robert Arthur Hawkins was planning his own unwanted gift. Robert arrived with a Century WASR-10 semi-automatic rifle hidden beneath his hooded sweatshirt, along with 2 30-round magazines taped together. Without hesitation, Robert headed straight for the elevator, the same one he'd mentally marked during an earlier reconnaissance visit. At exactly 1:43 p.m., the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor. Robert stepped out and immediately opened fire, aiming downward through the open space to hit anybody he possibly could. Having already taken down at least 6 people, he turned his attention to the customer service desk. Robert had fired 41 rounds in total, striking 12 people. His magazines, which had contained 60 rounds, still held ammunition. But instead of continuing, he made his final decision. Placing the rifle under his chin, Hawkins fired one last shot upward through his jaw, ending his own life. The entire attack lasted just 6 minutes. When police arrived, they found 8 people dead and 4 wounded. 6 of the victims were Von Mauer employees, 2 were customers. In the aftermath, investigators found the 3-page note Robert had left at home of him explaining that he had had enough of life and wanted to take people with him. Florida. On the night of March 1st, 2023, Domenico Claude Gigante, a 36-year-old man with a violent history stretching back 18 years, sat in his Rockledge, Florida home nursing a familiar rage. 2 days earlier, he told his roommate about his frustrations with his 15-year-old daughter, Kiara, who refused to rebuild their relationship. He decided the only solution was to kill them all. At exactly 1 a.m., Domenico climbed into his silver Dodge pickup truck carrying a gun. Ring camera footage captured him heading toward the home where his daughter lived with her mother, grandmother, and stepfather. It took 18 minutes to get there, and he instantly forced his way into the house where 3 generations of the Terwilliger family slept peacefully. Domenico moved through the house, shooting his daughter's mother and her boyfriend in the living room. He found his ex-mother-in-law in her bedroom and shot her in the head as she lay in bed. Finally, he went to his daughter's room and shot her 3 times, leaving her bleeding profusely. But 2 other family members were in the house, narrowly avoiding the rampage. The 2 young boys made a FaceTime call to their mother's boyfriend, telling him through tears that everyone was dead. When he arrived at the scene, he found exactly what the terrified child had described: 4 bodies and blood everywhere. He immediately called 911 and deputies arrived to confirm the deaths. Meanwhile, Domenico had returned to his home, where investigators found him hours later throwing incriminating items into a trash can. He claimed to be shocked, but his roommate told them the truth. The evidence quickly mounted against Domenico. He was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree premeditated homicide. The grand jury later indicted him on 4 counts of first-degree premeditated homicide. Georgia. A 10-year-old girl named Imani Gabriel Moss had been telling people she was afraid. She had already told her school counselor that her parents had been harming her. Her stepmother, Tiffany Moss, was convicted of cruelty to children for beating the girl with a belt. She received 5 years probation. But Imani's grandmother, Robin Moss, fought desperately for custody, believing that she was being mistreated for years. In fact, the family had been under DFCS investigation for Imani's entire life. She had been so thin that people knew something was going on, but the complaint was always screened out due to no evidence of maltreatment. During the final months of her life, Imani lived under conditions that would kill her. Tiffany Moss kept the child confined to her bedroom, refusing her food while feeding her own 2 biological children. Imani wasted away in that back room. By late October, she was having seizures in the bathtub. When her father found her shaking violently, instead of calling 911, he placed her on a mattress on the bedroom floor. On October 28, 2013, Imani died. She weighed 32 pounds. Her father came home from work to find her cold and lifeless, but he did nothing. The body remained in the apartment for days while he continued his work routine, trying to dispose of her remains on Halloween night. They couldn't sufficiently burn the body, leading to their discovery. The case exposed systematic failures in the system, but Tiffany Moss was sentenced to death, becoming the only woman on Georgia's death row. She had represented herself at trial, offering no defense. Iman Moss received life without parole. Still in the mood for more disturbing icebergs? Why not check out this video on the most disturbing live stream incidents?